Hello, and welcome to the official podcast of CallUponTheLord.com. My name's Corey Wigington, and this is episode 13. This week, we're going back in time because I messed up. Somehow, as I was looking through the stories that I needed to discuss with you, I missed Ruth, and I don't know how I did that. So, Ruth, of course, is a little 4-chapter book tucked away between the book of Judges and the book of Samuel. I'm not really sure how I missed that, but we're going to go back in time today to back before Solomon and David and Saul, basically before Samuel even. Right in the time of the Judges, we're going to be discussing Ruth. So, sorry about that. That should have been on week 9, I think. But we're on week 13, so never fear, we'll not forget Ruth. We'll just go back and get her, and then we'll proceed forward. So, other housekeeping items. I thought since I had made this mistake with Ruth that we'd go ahead and cover some of the other mistakes that I have made over some of the previous podcasts. The problem is I don't really work off of a script so much. I do have my trusty study guides here with me, but a lot of times when I get talking, I'm just rolling off the top of my head, just speaking, and a lot of times I misspeak, and I do apologize for that. And I'd like to go back and correct at least 2 of the errors that I have done previously, and these are just the ones that, as I have listened to my podcasts that I've done previously, I've kind of gone over. It's like, wait a minute, that wasn't right. So 2 of them that I have caught, and there may be more, I don't know. But 2 of them that I have caught was, first when we were talking about Moses and Aaron, there was a section in there where we were talking about Miriam as well, where Aaron and Miriam had confronted Moses about his leadership of the Israelites. And I had said during that time that Miriam was Aaron's wife. Well, that's not true. Miriam was Aaron's sister and also Moses' sister. Miriam played quite a big role during the time of the Exodus. I mean, she was the one that watched Moses head down the river and be picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. She was the one that was able to convince Pharaoh's daughter that Moses' mother could be the nursemaid for him. She was, helped lead the people. There's a place in the Exodus where it talks about Miriam's song. I mean, she was quite an important character in that story. And the reason why Aaron and Miriam had confronted Moses was because they were such big parts of the Exodus. They were the part of the leadership of Israel at that time. So that was the whole reason why they had gotten together, and I incorrectly identified her as Aaron's wife. So that is not true. She's Aaron's sister. Secondly, just last week, I talked about the city of David and said that was Jerusalem. Well, that is and is not true. There is part of a little suburb of Jerusalem today that is called the city of David. But in biblical times, the city of David is actually Bethlehem. So, a little mistake there. Just like to correct that. I guess what I run into here is, this whole thing, this podcast, the website that I do, all the stuff on Facebook that I write, and blogs and everything. The reason why I do that is for practice. I mean, the best way to learn something is to teach it. Well, I am in seminary myself. I'm learning all the different theologies and such. I have a good biblical background. I mean, I've been a Christian for 30 some odd years. But, there's a difference between knowing something and teaching something, being able to convey it properly so people understand it. And that's what I kind of run into is, I'm practicing, basically. So this whole thing is practice for me, so in years to come, I'll be a good preacher and I'll be a good professor. But for right now, I'm still human, and probably will still be human, actually, when I'm a preacher and a professor too, but ignore that. So I do make mistakes, and I apologize for that. I will try to correct them as I do find them. So I guess what keeps me going through this is, even though I do make mistakes, everybody makes mistakes. There are certainly better preachers out there than I am. I know one of my favorites is John MacArthur. I listen to him all the time, and I just think the man's excellent. But I have heard him in some of his sermons make mistakes, misnaming somebody or inaccurately referring to somebody. And here's a man that's been preaching for, since the 60s. I mean, he's been preaching a long time, and he still, sometimes misidentifies something. And the thing is, I know that he knows it. I know that, this is not a new revelation to him. But sometimes he misspeak. Obviously, he conveys the word a little bit better than I do, and certainly his command over the Hebrew and Greek biblical languages is far superior than my own and such. But he had to start somewhere too, and I am aspiring to be as good as what the John MacArthurs are, or some of the other great teachers of our day today. So that's where I'm at right now. I do appreciate you bearing with me through this. So, that being said, let's get started on Ruth today. I bet this is only going to be about a 30 or 40 minute section here. Ruth is actually kind of a small book. Like I said, it's only 4 chapters. It is a short story, but it is a good story. You remember, as we were talking about the book of Judges, the book of Judges actually ended by saying something to the effect that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And we talked about how evil that was, that when you don't really have that moral compass, when you don't have God set out there as being, this is my example, this is my goal, how I'm going to act and behave, you kind of end up doing your own thing and sinning. So that was where we ended up in Judges, where people were doing what was right in their own eyes. Now we're here in Ruth, and this is still in the days of the Judges. But here we see a little bit different perspective, where even though a lot of the people are still doing what's right in their own eyes, there are still some good and righteous men living in Israel, and Boaz is one of them. So for our introduction, chronologically, Ruth does take place at the end of the Judges period. And we see that later on because Ruth ends up being basically the great-grandmother to David. So you see where it's kind of set in the time frame here. According to Jewish tradition, Samuel wrote this book, though as I was looking through and doing some research on this, there's, I guess with every book of the Bible, there's a lot of debate on, who wrote this or who did this, or whether there was multiple authors to certain books. I'm just going to stick with Samuel wrote this. It's probably the simplest explanation without going into a lot of higher criticism and, whether this was written prior to the exile or after the exile to Babylon. We're just going to stick with Samuel wrote this book. Now, the book doesn't actually claim that Samuel wrote it, but given the events that take place in the book, Samuel would have had knowledge of all of this. So, also, Ruth, like I said just a second ago, Ruth is actually in the genealogy of David. She was his great-grandmother, which the genealogy basically shows how David, had his right to the throne. He was in the tribe of Judah, and we'll talk about in a few minutes how that all kind of came together and how David was still in the line of Judah. Boaz is also seen as a Christ-like figure because he ends up redeeming the land that Naomi sells. He redeems. He is the kinsman redeemer for Naomi, and ends up acting as a Old Testament Christ-like figure. So let's jump into our story here. Ruth opens up with there being a famine in the land of Israel. It says that Elimelech and Naomi were kind of in some hard times here, and so they decided instead of staying in Israel that they would go to the land of Moab and ride out this famine. Now, Elimelech and Naomi at this time had two sons. Their sons were Mahlon and Chilion. And just as a point of reference, Elimelech means my God is king. Naomi means pleasant. Mahlon means sick, and Chilion means pining. So, names in the Old Testament, I think we've discussed this before, names in the Old Testament a lot of times carried a lot of meaning, so you could really tell a lot about a person's character by the name that they had. So, they traveled to the land of Moab, and well, let's take a look here. Moab is not that far really from Bethlehem. That's where they traveled from, was Bethlehem. So you see they traveled probably up and over the Dead Sea area, and then they landed in Moab down there. Pretty close, but it is outside of where Israel was. The Moabites, of course, they had a little different view. I mean, they warred with Israel some. David experienced peace with the Moabites, but one of the things is they served the god Chemosh, and Chemosh was, of course, one of those deities that required like child sacrifice and such. So I mean, they had some different things going on down there, very evil and wicked things. But here, we have a family moving down there. Like I said, Elimelech, his name was My God is King. Shows you he was a godly man heading down there. So once they get down to the land of Moab, they're down there for about 10 years, riding out this famine in the land of Israel. And during that time, Mahlon and Chilion, they both end up with marrying women from the land of Moab. Of course, when we talked about this last week, marrying foreign wives could get you into trouble. Well, at least one of them did it right. Chilion married Orpah, and Mahlon married Ruth. Now, Orpah means stubborn, Ruth means friendship. So, during this whole 10-year period, Elimelech dies, Mahlon dies, and Chilion dies. So all the men in this little story are now dead. And that leaves Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. Of course, one of the problems with this, is that during this time period, women really didn't have an identity in and of themselves. I mean, they were referred to as the daughter of, or the wife of, or the mother of. They were really referred to as, their identity was based upon the relationship to the patriarch of the family. So since there was no patriarch in this family, well, really these women have kind of lost their identity here. And it further complicates things because now there's no one to pass the inheritance on to. So Elimelech dies. He was supposed to leave his inheritance to his children. Now somehow, whether the children died first or whether it was because they were in a foreign land and something didn't happen right, the inheritance did not go to Mahlon or Chilion. Instead, when Elimelech died, it went to Naomi. So Naomi has basically the inheritance, but she can't pass it on to anybody because she has no children. There were some Old Testament laws about, for the most part, it passed on to the firstborn son. I mean, we talked about that a little bit previously, where you could, most of the time the firstborn was the one that received the blessing and the birthright, but you could, depending upon what that child had done, give it to someone else. But generally speaking, it went to the first, eligible male heir. Well, there was some Old Testament laws that said, if there's no male heir, a female could still inherit the land. But here, what we have is Naomi is basically the one who has the land because Orpah and Ruth are Moabites. I mean, they can't inherit the land. The land has to stay inside of Israel, so they can't have the land. It has to stay with Naomi. And Naomi really doesn't have any children or anything to be able to pass the land on to. So we got some problems arising here. So what happens is we move on a little bit, and after all the males in this family have died, Naomi decides she wants to move back to Israel. I think Israel 1:4 maybe? Is that right? Let me check that out real fast. That is not right, and I didn't document that. Well, I'm not going to look for that right now, but right here in this first chapter, it talks about the Lord visiting Israel and giving them bread. Basically, the famine was over, and that's why Naomi and Ruth decided to return. Well, let's read here in Ruth 1:6 through 13. We're going to look at the kind of the loyalty that Ruth has to Naomi. Let's just take a look at that here. It says, "Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited the people and given them food." There it is. So she set out from the place where she was with her daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will not return. We will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they're grown? Would you therefore refrain from marriage? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone against me." And they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you, or return from following you. For where you will go, I will go, and where you will lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and my God, your God, my God." So I actually read a little bit more there than what I had intended, but what we basically are looking at here is Naomi's trying to do right by her daughters-in-law. She realizes that she is too old to have a husband. She can't have any more sons, and even if she could, if she got pregnant right then and was able to have children, it was going to be 15, 20 years before those kids were grown up, ready to have wives. And she's basically telling her daughters-in-law, "Are you going to wait that long for husbands? You shouldn't have to do that." So she implored them, "Go home." Well, Orpah did. Orpah decided, "All right, I've had enough. Let's just leave." Ruth was the loyal one here, and she said, "No, your people will be my people, and your God my God." This is where we really see Ruth comes out and says, "Look, I've forsaken Chemosh and all those gods over there that the Moabites worship. Your God is my God." So she's basically saying that she is believes in the God of Israel, believes in Yahweh, and that she's not going to forsake Naomi. So they end up returning to Israel. They return to basically the land that Elimelech had owned previously. Now, what we poor Naomi. I mean, she comes out. Of course, as soon as they come into town, I mean, everybody knows her because, I mean, this is Bethlehem. This was a small town. If you ever come from a small town, you know that everybody knows everybody and their brothers and sisters and cousins and whatnot. I mean, it's, she comes home and everybody's like, oh yeah, that's Naomi. I remember her. And she tells him, it's like, no, don't call me Naomi anymore. Instead, call me Mara. Mara means bitter. Now, we remember that back from Exodus 15:23, where the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness, and they came to the land of Mara, and the water there was bitter. And that's where that comes from. So, she's basically saying, call me Mara, I'm bitter. The Lord has turned his hand against me. He's taken away my husband and my children. I have nothing now. So, Naomi's having a little bit of a pity party here, but, I mean, she's going through a rough haul. And, she's returning to the land of Israel. She really has nothing. I mean, she still has the land that Elimelech had, but, I mean, there's really, no one to work it or to, do anything on it. So, she's a widow. Her daughter is a widow, and, they are poor. So during this time, there was a custom where you could go out and glean for food. Now, what this was, gleaning was a practice where if you owned an area of land where you had your crops set out, you would go through and you would harvest your field. But you would only go through your field one time. You'd go through, you'd harvest whatever you had. You wouldn't pick up anything that fell down on the ground. You instead would leave it there. After you had finished harvesting the field, then it was customary to allow all the widows, orphans, strangers, anybody that was poor basically, to come through your land and glean, basically pick up all the rest of the food that was on your field and take for themselves. So, I mean, that was something that the Lord had commanded. This was, something that they did for all the poor, basically. When they harvested a field, people would come in and glean for food. So that's what Ruth did. Her and Naomi, of course, were poor, and they were widows. So she said, I'm going to go out. Boaz, we're related to him. I'm going to go out to his field, and I'm going to glean for food. So no big ambitions here right yet. I mean, she's just going out to glean for food. Except while she's out there gleaning, Boaz comes home. And Boaz sees her out in the field, and he asks after her. And it's like, who is this girl? So, says, he took compassion on her. And I have a note here from one of my, the Henry? Matthew Henry's commentary on the whole Bible. He says, he encouraged her to go on gleaning, and did not offer to take her off from that. For the great kindness we can do our poor relations is to assist and encourage their industry. Boaz ordered his servants to let her glean among the sheaves, where the other gleaners were now not allowed to come, and did not reproach her, basically not call her a thief, or suspect that she had taken more than what was given to her, or allowed to her. So Boaz said, follow along in this other field that they had just finished, basically giving her first pickings of the new field. And then after that, he came and had a meal and offered her as much food as she could eat, and then some extra beyond that, and said, go among the sheaves and glean from them. Basically take what you want from there, and let no one call you a thief or anything. Basically, he just gave her that. So he was being a very good, honest, and upright man, and really helping her out here. So Ruth goes home to Naomi and says, look, I met Boaz. He did all this nice stuff for me. He gave me gave me all this food, help let me glean from a new field, let me take from the sheaves. Then he fed me. And Ruth is like, Naomi's like, wow, this is great. because Boaz is a near relation to us. He can be our kinsman redeemer. Now this was important because depending upon your relationship to whatever dead brother or cousin or whatever, if you were the closest living male relative, you had the obligation to continue on the line of that male relative. So if that male relative died without leaving an heir, your obligation was to lie with his wife to provide that heir, and then the firstborn son or daughter or whatever would belong to the person that had died. They wouldn't be legally your child, they would be their child. So Boaz, he was likely in his 50s here. He was much older than Ruth, and we know that because Boaz kept referring to the people in his fields as the young men, the young women. He was setting himself apart as being older. So at this time, Naomi and Ruth, like I said, they were very poor here. Naomi had even gone as far as to sell Elimelech's land. They had nothing. They had to get money somehow. So just to pay for their living expenses, they ended up selling Elimelech's land. But in Israel, it's an interesting concept. No land was actually ever sold, really. Land was more rented out because it could never leave the family that it was basically given to initially. So the idea was that if one of your ancestors had ever gotten land, that land would stay in your family forever. Even if you sold the land, every 50 years was the year of Jubilee. And during that time, the land, if you had sold it to someone else, the ownership would revert back to you and your family. So that was a way of restoring land to somebody else. You could sell your land to someone else, and then they could farm it or whatever. Basically, you can think of it like they'd probably pay a prorated fee on it or whatever. That if it was 14 years, then the year of Jubilee, that they would pay for that 14 years basically of rent to do something on your land, and then after the 14 years, you get the land back. So the kinsman redeemer was, if he was the closest living male relative, he could provide an heir and also buy back the land. It was his responsibility to buy back that land for the family. So closest living relative, that was their responsibility. So let's read here Ruth 3, 1 through 13. We'll go in and talk about that just a little bit further, because that's really what the rest of the book is about here. All right, and we have here, it says, Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore, and anoint yourself, and put your cloak and gown down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go, uncover his feet, and lie down. And he will tell you what you to do. And she replied, All that you say I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor, and did as her mother-in-law had commanded. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, Who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you what you have asked. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. Now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until morning. So a lot of things going on here. First off, Naomi sends Ruth to Boaz. And Boaz is out there. It says he's winnowing his barley. Basically what that was is you would throw the barley up into the air, and the wind would come and blow all the debris or whatever after barley. It's a way of cleaning the barley, basically. So it'd blow all the chaff and such out of the barley. So he's out there doing that, and he probably lays down in this threshing area to kind of protect it, protect his barley, that no one comes and steals it from him. So Naomi tells Ruth, after he's done, go lie down at his feet. Now you'll notice here, there's no sexual immorality going on here. I mean, she goes down, uncovers his feet, and then lays down at his feet. And, basically is waiting there for Boaz to tell her what to do. He wakes up, being the honorable man that he is. He says, I am your redeemer, yet there's one closer. So he's not just going to take this on, he's wanting to make sure that this is done properly. And he even calls her my daughter, again, reinforcing the fact that he is, quite a bit older than she is. He calls her an honorable woman, that she's not, going around doing things that would bring her dishonor. But he says, there is a redeemer nearer than I. I'll go, I'll see if he will redeem you. If not, then I will. So, like I said earlier, and it was the responsibility for the nearest male relative to redeem the land, to redeem, basically provide an heir for Naomi and for Ruth. So Boaz, being the honorable man that he is, he decides he will take this on. So the next day, it says he goes down, meets with a quorum of 10 men, and asks, basically has the guy there that is closer in relation to Elimelech. Now, Boaz was either a brother of Elimelech or a cousin. So there was one closer, whether it was an older brother or an older cousin or something like that. But there was one a little closer to that should have been, had that responsibility. So Boaz asks him, he says, will you redeem the land? And he says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was not a good thing for him to do. I mean, we see this other places in the Bible where this is actually where a woman would go before the elders of a town and say, this man won't redeem me. And, the elders would say, are you not going to redeem this woman? He would say no, and the woman would literally spit in his face. This was his responsibility to do, and he's saying, no, I can't do it. And that might be a reason why this man's name is not mentioned. His name's really not important to the story, but it could be that his name's not here as kind of a, because he dishonored himself by not redeeming Ruth here. So Boaz, on the other hand, he accepts this responsibility and says, yes, I will be the redeemer here. And he ends up taking Ruth as his wife. Now, as we discussed previously, according to the law, the idea of redeeming the land, so he basically bought back the land that was that didn't belong to Naomi sold the land, so he bought the land back to give to his new child. The reason why, when a child was born in this relationship, so as the Redeemer, he married Ruth, and he would be taking the place of Mahlon here. So the first child from their union would actually belong to Mahlon. and not to Boaz. And that way the line of Mahlon would continue on, and Boaz wouldn't be legally his father. Well, legally his father, but the inheritance of Mahlon would go down through the child, and Boaz basically wouldn't be entitled to it. So Boaz was, of course, in the line of Judah, because Elimelech was also in the line of Judah, obviously. Where did Ruth come from, though? Ruth was a Moabite. The Moabites actually descended down through Lot. So an interesting thing, we trace Boaz's lineage back through Abraham, and then Ruth's lineage comes down through Lot. So we have Israelite and Moabite marrying each other. And it ends up working out well. I mean, Obed is born out of this union here. Obed, of course, was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. So we have here this union because Boaz redeemed Ruth. Now we have the complete lineage of King David, and basically on down to the Messiah, that Jesus was born, and he can trace his lineage back to Boaz and Ruth. So kind of an interesting thing there. Ruth is a very important story. It gives us an idea of where Christ came from. It gives us more details of his lineage, and shows a little bit about Boaz and him being the kinsman redeemer, kind of symbolic of what Christ does for the church and for Israel. I mean, he basically dies for our sins and then buys us back. The story that we learn out of this, of course, is even when times are the hardest or the most dire, God's always there. He's always working. Naomi didn't think so. Now, Naomi, she goes back and remember, she went back to Bethlehem and said, "Call me Mara. Call me, because I'm bitter. The Lord's been against me. He's turned his hand against me, and I have nothing now. He's taken everything from me." But the Lord was still working in her life and in Ruth's life. You see here that the child born out of this union ended up being in the line of the Messiah. I mean, this was a plan from the beginning, that she would have to endure this hardship, so Ruth could be brought back to find Boaz, and their union would, of course, continue on the line. I mean, God's always there. He's always working. He's always involved with his people. So when times get tough, pray about it, because God's always working in your life. That's some good advice right there. That brings us to the end of our study this week. Week 13, Ruth, which should have been, of course, week 9. So next week, I think we're going to be looking at how the kingdom starts falling apart, how Israel and Judah separate, and how things start going downhill after Solomon. You remember last week we talked about Solomon, how the kingdom was going to be ripped away from his son. Well, that's what we're going to be covering next week. So I hope you join us back here next time. Hopefully we'll get it recorded on Thursday next week instead of Friday. But I'm glad you joined us, and hopefully you join us back here next time. So until then, have a good week.